Okay, welcome back. We're gonna finish this ear now. Um, I don't know if we'll do the whole thing at this session, but let's at least try to paint this continuation from the tragus into the sort of inner cavity of the ear. You'll notice that this is one of the darkest regions of the painting, so let's check some values before we do anything else. So, right in here, let's check this one first. There's that one. It's our deepest shadow. And that is definitely a little lighter than 1 and a little lighter than 2. Actually, it's between 2 and 3. With maybe, let's just check this darkest spot right here. That's about 2. And then we've already established that our lights are, well, let's just check them. Like this one here. So similar to what we used up here, it's around 8, 8.5. And then in between our middle values, 5, 6, basically about 5. So we go from about 2.5 here to 5, and then way up to 8.5 down here. So that'll give us a few points of reference to work from. So let's zoom in on the area we're going to be painting today. That's the great thing about working digitally, is you can always zoom into your reference and get a really good look at what you need to do in a way that's difficult when you're painting from life. Sometimes it's almost a little too much information, though. So we're going to start with 2. Just way down here on my palette. And a little bit of water. And I'm going to pop that into these darkest regions of brown. Very thinly. Because again, you see all that nice brown showing through. We don't want to cover that up. And I would say something similar goes up here. And also right up in here. Now that's too dark, but the point is it's very thin, so you're going to see what happens. We can just drag some midtones right into it. Okay, and I said number 5 for the main part of the shadow, which is about like that. And again, very thin. none of this area that I'm laying in right here has any direct light hitting it, only reflected light. However, it is pretty bright reflected light up in here, so I'm going to go up to a number 6. And I'm not, it's very tempting. I want to blend this and make it all look pretty, but we don't care how pretty it looks now. We're just trying to stay focused on the task, which is laying it in. While I have that 6 on my brush, I'm going to use it to create a little transition for down here, because I can already tell this is going to be a very soft transition. And now I'm going to hop all the way up to like 8.5. Very light right here. Almost as bright as the white of the underpainting. And while I have that on my brush, I'm going to go ahead and put in a little bit of my light right up in here. Because this transition is something we're going to have to deal with today. Now I'm cleaning my brush, and that was fast, but no, I'm not quite going to lay in yet. I think I'm going to put some number 6. See this little stripe up here? A little 6 right there, and maybe a little 6 for the reflected light under here. Okay, now I'm going to do some blending. And see how gradual this transition is? So I'm going to hatch across that transition. And it's so easy if you put the paint on thin enough. You can sharpen and soften an edge effortlessly as long as your paint's not thick. And you see how this got just a little bit too dark right here? Again, the paint is so thin that I can get a little more 8.5 on my brush, and I can just pull that value up half step or a step without having to fight it, because the paint is barely there. And remember, that's why we do the underpainting, because we can get these very solid effects using very thin paint, because we're not trying to change the value much with the top paint. Our values are already there. We're basically just changing the hue a little bit. So here again, like last time, we have a very strong feeling of reflected light coming through here. But we're not going to try to achieve that by brightening this. We're going to achieve it by putting a little bit of dark through the core shadow. And notice how as soon as you do that, the reflected light starts to pop. course, we don't want it to look like a little brown stripe or black stripe. So then we go and we hatch across the form like this to get that very narrow but soft transition. And then we hatch across it going the other way like this. And then we just sweep the brush once or twice to soften it out. And that was a careless little mistake. You see that? I just didn't wipe off my brush. I pulled some of that dark right into my light, but again, painting thinly, we can just lift off that mistake, get right back to our underpainting. Now when you get your painting to the point where you can look at it and say, I'm looking at something real. I'm looking past the surface of the canvas and into some kind of little three-dimensional space. You're going to have a huge advantage, because once that little sleight of hand is achieved, so that you're tricking part of your brain into thinking that you're seeing 3 dimensions, your brain's going to start telling you what looks wrong. But that only happens after you start to be able to read it that way. But you don't want to discourage that illusion. That's really important. So like right now I see I need a little more lightening through here, so I'm going to try pulling a little more like a number 5, maybe even a number 6 value. So that reflected light there is a little more intense. Drawing and painting ears, especially casts of ears, is a great way to learn about reflected light, because there's so many little forms that are opposing each other. Okay, well that was not too hard. Just gonna sharpen this edge right here. You see how that light against the shadow is a little crisper. And right there I can put the paint on a little thicker. I'm not afraid of a little piling on my lights a little bit. I want to keep it thin in the shadows. I'm just going to keep going because that didn't take as long as I thought it would. This is probably a good place for you to stop if you want to take a break, but let's see how far I can get today. So we're going to check some values up here, although I don't expect them to be much different. Let me get back to my value checker. So we've got right through here, I'm guessing more the 8.5. Yep. And in here, probably more between 3 and 5. So I'm going to say right there, darkest part is about 3. And this halftone here. See that one? All the way up to 6. So 4 to 6 through our shadows and clustering around 8.5 again in the lights. So 8.5, a little water. If your value scale is not exactly like mine, it's not going to make a huge difference because your relationships are still going to be right. And that's the most important thing. Your overall painting might be a little lighter or a little darker, but that's fine. It's just like you can take a photograph and it'll look pretty good if you raise the brightness or lower the brightness. It doesn't really matter. I do want to put this on thinly enough so that I can do some adjusting later. So see how this light comes around and sort of meets this one, but this one here is definitely a little brighter, and this one up here is a little brighter too. I'll just knock that in while I have it on my brush. And this kind of wraps around to here. This would be a good place to just fade that out. Okay, so that's the lights. And now the darks are going to be clustered around 3. So that's sort of right around there. Maybe closer to 2, way up the very top of this. And then transitioning, like we said, all the way up to about number 6 for this big halftone area. And once again, not trying to make it pretty, just laying it in, rough. Only laying in as much as I know I'm going to have time to blend. Do not want to get caught having to lay something in again because I ran out of time. And while I'm at it, I may as well do something with this shadow here, which is also going to be around 3 at the top. Through the core shadow. And then strong reflected light going up to about 6. And a little more of that 6 kind of finishes off this point. And also sort of connects up into here. And while I have the 6 on my brush, even 7, I might just, because this transition is so soft, may as well throw a little more of that in there. Okay, once again, kind of messy and crude, but the fun part is the blending. So, wipe my brush, and let's start right here, just hatching across. I remember when I was about maybe 10 years old and I was still taking piano lessons, which I never liked very much. And I remember looking at the piano one day and just thinking, if I could really just believe that I could play beautifully, if I had enough confidence, I could just play. I wouldn't have to be working so hard to learn how to do this. And of course I was wrong. But I get the feeling a lot of my students feel that way about drawing and painting sometimes. They feel like, because they'll just go for it as if that was going to work out, and it really doesn't. It'll work out once you have training, in the same way that, when you're great at piano, you can just sit down and improvise. But it doesn't work when you're trying to learn. And the important thing to realize is that if this seems tedious, which it is, that's just because you're not good at it yet. And once you get good at it, then you don't have to think about it anymore. You just do it. It's fun. Just like anything can be. So, it's important to realize that you're aiming for that goal. And that if this isn't fun now, it doesn't mean it won't be fun later. You kind of earn the right to enjoy it in the same way that nobody loves playing guitar when they first pick it up and try to get their fingers to curl around the fretboard, and such an unnatural way. There's really nothing more natural about painting than there is about playing guitar. I just kind of randomly switched from a piano analogy to a guitar analogy, but forgive me. So notice I'm sort of being a little more careful now. I'm shaping this light, which again I can do because the paint is thin. I can just subtly bump things around a little. Now I'm going to go do a massive softening along this edge. Notice how this edge is a little softer than this one up here. Notice too there's a very subtle reflected light in this shadow. It's a barely there thing, but by popping that in, it's going to make it feel like this form is turning downward a little bit. And now I'm going to just transition up into here. And there's even a very slight bit of reflected light bouncing around up in here. Not that bright, but just barely there. And those reflected lights, that's what gives your viewer all the information they need about the form, so don't overlook any of them. like I said, there's some subtle changes going on inside this light area here that I tried to put in before, but they sort of got erased by the subsequent blending. So I'm going to go back and take just a little bit of almost pure white, and you see how much impact that has? It's like a full half step brighter than what was there before. Just to sort of reinforce the outside of this form. And then go back and just lightly soften that edge again, because when I put my highlight in it, it got a little too bright. Keep cleaning my brush so I can soften a little transition like that without mucking it up. Okay, so the part that looks clumsy still is right here. And that's just blending. See how this light bleeds up into here a little bit more. So I'm just going to soften everything and knock it back a little. And then I'm going to go back with my highlight color again, that 8.5, and sharpen selectively. Okay, I'm going to move, finish between here and here, which this value is the same as what we were using yesterday. Wasn't that a 5? 5.5. And remember, I stopped there because it's a flat area. See, there's not much going on there. It's always a good place to stop, a place where there's no kind of fancy transitions to worry about. Making a little correction down here because I put that dark accent a little bit too high up. Hopefully you didn't do that, but if you just copied me, I apologize. And you see how that little accent I'm just putting in, it's not too sharp, so after laying it in, I just touch it a few more times, moving my brush the same direction as the edge to soften it. If it gets too soft, I can take a damp brush like I'm doing now and just pull right back up to it again. And now we're back to this flat stuff through here. And notice the core shadow, which was really dark here, like a 3, it gets not so dark, so I'm going to use a 4.5 up here. And I'm going to blend this area now. Notice that this form is turning. So to soften that edge, I'm going to start by putting a little stripe of slightly darker value, clean my brush, and then hatch across the edge like that again. little tiny strokes. And then clean it up with a bigger brush, sweeping with the edge. Okay, we are going to proceed. Again, this might be a good place to stop, but let's see if I can possibly finish this today. So that was a little too dark. I would say that should probably be about closer to 7. Didn't measure that. Why don't we measure it just to be on the safe side? So we're talking right up here. Let's see. Right there. And that is 6. Moving up to 7 up here. See that? Oh, I'm measuring the wrong spot. We're right here. We're not over here. Hang on. So this is where we are. So yeah, that is 6 there. And up here, probably 8.5 again. So 6 to 8.5. So here's what 6 looks like. So that's pretty good. And we're going to put, I would say, the same value up into here, thinly. Notice how there's not too much contrast between this is called the helix of the ear, and the anti-helix, which is inside it. So I want to have a sharp edge, a clear sharp edge, but not a big value jump. People always exaggerate value jumps on sharp edges because the sharpness of the edge makes you think there's more of a jump than there is. And they minimize the value jumps on soft edges. So see what's happening here? We've got an underneath shadow here, and then a shadow to the right here, and then we've got our big light which sort of narrows and then comes around again. So we're going to go into the lights now with, start with a nice thin layer of 8.5. Very thin. I'm not used to spending this much time at home, and I never quite realized how much my dogs bark. Okay, let's zoom out a little so you can take this in. Okay, so obviously what's wrong right now is no blending. So this was 8.5, that was 6. So I'm going to put some number 7 in between to start softening my edge. And then just see how soft this is. It's a gradually curving form, so it's going to be a matter of hatching across that edge. And then across this edge. And as I transition into here, I can see a little bit of lightening on the outside of that curve. Can you see that? It's right here. And our reflected light value has been pretty much consistent at around 6.5 to 7. So I'm going to try just lightening this edge a tiny bit with that value. Now notice when I blended, my shadow came up too high through here. So again, the paint is so thin, I can easily take number 8 value and just a little extra paint, and I can force that edge back down to where I want it at the same time that I'm doing a little more blending. And I'm going to go back and try to soften it again, but this time, instead of bringing the dark up, I'm going to try to bring the light down. Okay, and then final smoothing, clean brush, and very light pressure, just going with the edge again. And I feel like the shadow side is okay now. Except I got a little too much reflected light right under here, so I'm going to go back down to my number 4 and just sort of flatten that out a little. And now I just need to organize my lights. I do that by cleaning my brush, drying it off, and just sweeping it through this area to unify it. Sort of like a back and forth process. You lay things in, then you fuzz them out, and then it gets a little too fuzzy, and then you go back in and your finishing touches sort of tighten it up again. And in this case, the finishing touch is going to be my lightest value, not exactly at the edge, but close to the edge. This again is about 8.5. And that's about all it takes. This edge could be just a little cleaner. There we go. So this would be another okay place to stop. But if you were going to stop, you'd want to look around at any areas that kind of stand out as being maybe not blended enough. Like, I just stepped away for a minute, and when I came back, I saw, like, whoa, what's going on here? So, just going to soften that out. Because remember, these sort of fixes cannot be done when the paint is dry. And after it dries, you just have to repaint the whole area. And that's a frustrating waste of time. This area looks a little underblended to me, so. And actually, having left the painting for a minute, the water evaporates out and the paint becomes a little stiffer and therefore a little easier to do really accurate blending. And it just responds at this stage to the slightest touch. And even though I like the effect of some brown showing through, I feel like it's a little extreme right here, so I never really took care of that little transition. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to look at the forms in the painting and just ask myself if they're legible in the same way that they are in the photograph, or maybe even more legible. That's the goal. You want every form in the painting to be actually more legible than the photograph shows. And I kind of missed this little secondary shadow over here, so it's a little halftone that I didn't notice before. And we're going to keep moving. I'm going to keep moving. Like I said, this would be a fine time for you to take a break if you are inclined, but I'm going to go right into this zone. And I think I don't need to measure values because I already know what they are. This was 7 for my strong reflected light value. And see how this little stripe of reflected light, oh, that looks too bright, maybe 6. That little stripe gets wider right through here. And along here I've got my 8.5 again. And as it transitions here, I'm going to just pick up a little 7 and a little 6. I'm going to pick up the 6 again down here. These are all the areas in the underpainting that have that kind of watery brown on them. And in between I have an actual shadow, so I'm going to throw in some number 3 right through here and see what that does. And let's see, this needed to be a little wider. And you just got to look and see how much worse the lay-in looks than the finished areas. But you can't let that psych you out. It's just gonna be that way. But I'm gonna just show you what it's like to try to work fast here. I'm gonna try laying in the rest of the ear. Let me just check the value on this earlobe for a second. So we're examining this spot right here. That's the value, and that's going to be 5. That's what I thought. Okay, number 5 right there, right in the middle of my value scale. And I'm putting a little water in my paint and just getting a nice clean edge here. I won't even have to retouch it. Just like that. And then this 5 here is going to transition up into that, which was also 5. And I'm going to go down to 3 for this core shadow. And I'm going to lay in the rest of this with, I'm going to say 7 to 8, but let's do one more check. So we're measuring right here. This one, yep, 7. Interesting. That's really the lightest part is 7, and this goes down to 6.5. So it would be easy to make these lights too bright because they are so surrounded by dark. Remember that, but that's why we measure things. When I was in graduate school, we had to paint value scales onto these wooden paint sticks, and then we would hold them up in front of whatever we were looking at and try to measure the values that way. And it was kind of hard because you had to hold your paint stick so it was facing up towards the light just a little. So up here we've got some slightly brighter lights. So I'm going to go back to my main 8.5 light color, which is going to get us started with this area. And I'm going to put just a little bit brighter right through here. So that's rough, but that's most of the lay-in right there. You see how everything looks, all the values are accounted for. And all we have left mainly is fooling around with edges. So for that, it would be helpful to go back to the main view and maybe to zoom in a little. Not that much. So let's start right here. Hatch across that edge. There's probably nothing less creative in the world of art than cast painting. Because you didn't sculpt the cast, neither did I. And in this case, you didn't even choose the design because I photographed it for you. If you were in a classroom, you might have it hung on the wall for you and it would mount to about the same thing. Although you could at least crop it differently if you wanted to. But creativity is a challenge in and of itself, and it's nice to sort of solve some of the technical problems without worrying about being creative. Just sort of experiment to see what you can do with your brush. Just let the process, feel gradually easier and easier. And then when you want to do something creative, you're going to find all these new resources are just at your fingertips. So notice we got this strong light that I just painted and blended. That looks pretty good. And then it goes into this very flat halftone for a while. So I'm going to try to capture that by just using really thin, flat paint. I'm just taking the paint that's there and spreading it around. And that's a great way to let the brown show through. And then I had this reflected light up here with a little bit of a core shadow coming through it. I'm going to connect with that core shadow into the new paint. Let's just drag that slight darkening through there. and that was good. That's like, you gotta learn to recognize when you can do something in one brush stroke that works, just leave it alone. You don't want to keep just fiddling with it for no reason. Great painters will, think for 5 minutes about a brush stroke and then try it and then wipe it off and then think 5 more minutes and try it again. Because they want that one brush stroke to do so much. And mediocre painters like me like to just turn our brains off and just sort of pick away at it till it looks good. Obviously, it's better to be a little more deliberate. Okay, so here's that little shadow. That cast shadow under the helix, that should be about a number 3. And what happens to it? It goes from being a hard overlap up here to being just a soft indent. So as I bring it down, I'm going to just do some softening with my brush. And then that indent just sort of barely continues down. To here, and then lo and behold, it turns into a light. You see that? There's passages like this that just give you seems like there's so much going on. You just get a headache looking at it. At a certain point, you just have to sit back and look at what you've done and ask yourself, well, can I read the forms or not? And if you can't, try some more. Soften this edge a little. Soften this edge. We haven't touched that yet. So I'm really sort of tackling a lot in this session. You probably want to break this into chunks or just set aside a long time for painting. So I could go a little darker. See the core shadow under the earlobe? Don't you think that could be a little darker right there? So that's going to be number 3 again. And this isn't a lay-in. This is really a kind of a fine-tuning. So notice as I'm putting the paint in, I'm sort of blending it, doing 2 things at once. And time for maybe a bigger brush, blending some of these softening some of these big areas. Notice that I saved this kind of massive chunk of painting for the last step, because I'm hoping that by now you have a sense of how much you can get done in one day, and you can sort of chunk it out your own way, whatever way feels good to you. And see the warmth in this shadow? That's actually, I'm liking that. I just don't like that it's a little too splotchy, so I'm taking a clean dry brush and I'm just sort of unifying that area. Same thing over here. I'm just gonna use this clean brush, sort of soften, blend everything. And the last sort of messy mess is right up in here, so more of the same, just clean brush. I'm going to go around this form with a series of strokes. And that's not really doing much because I don't have enough paint on there, so I'm going to put a little more paint on there and try that again. And a little bit of that lighter color, not all the way to the edge, but just a little bit inside it. I'd rather leave that little bit of brown along the edge because it helps make the form turn away from me. Looks like it's kind of receding. And this little area here to be cleaned up. Again, just keeping that paint so thin. And a little darker in my core shadow there, I think. Let me go back to 3 through here. Pull that a little further down. And I'm going to let that just sort of bleed into my reflected light. Sort of knock that back. I got a little too much brown right along this edge, so I'm going to use a number 8 value, which is sort of a half tone value. I'm going to just pull down into my core shadow a little bit with that, and then soften that edge again. And for my final bit of retouching, I'm going to just want this edge here to stand out a little more, and I happen to have a little mistake there. You see that little brush stroke that went a little too far? And this might not be my final. Just a second. So I'm going to take this opportunity to just clean up this edge a little while just brightening it a tiny, tiny bit. This might be a little brighter than the photograph, but maybe I'm being creative. I just want this edge to pop a little more. So I want the sharpness of this edge to really stand out next to all the soft stuff going on inside the ear. Okay. And then I noticed also that I really went too dark on this core shadow. Can everyone see that? It's not the end of the world. If you did it like that and you leave it, that's fine, but I think this area of my painting is still wet, so what I'm going to do is just go in and soften some of these edges. And this is the kind of work that you would do at the end of a day of painting. You just put the painting on the wall across the room, and then all these little mistakes are going to jump out at you, and this is the time to try to fix them. So I'm going to go over this with 4. Still a core shadow, but it's not so abrupt and dark. Might just have to scrub it out. See what I'm doing? Just scrub that out and then shape it by painting a little bit more of this reflected light on that side, which is now just a little too bright, but let's scrub that out too. And then a little more of this light color on the other side. So this is number 8, and I'm going to bring this down. Make that core shadow a little skinnier. Now, obviously, I could spend the rest of the weekend fine-tuning this. And you could spend the rest of the semester fine-tuning yours, and that's good, but there is a point of diminishing returns. And ultimately, can get across the room from your painting and look at it and say, this is okay. Then that's not a bad time to quit. And I think that's where I am right now. So thank you for joining me for this adventure, and I can't wait to see your paintings. Adios.